So we study the solar system, we learn about planets, we learn about moons. To learn about these different worlds, the moons and the planets, we need to look at them and figure out how does what they look like tell us what's going on inside or how they came to be that way. So our best tool is actually going to the world, landing spacecraft on it, setting up a laboratory there, and intensely studying it in person. That's not realistic for most of these worlds. Second best tool is sending a small robotic spacecraft there to land, to take samples in one or two spots on the surface and tell us about that. That's better, but that still doesn't tell us a whole lot. The most common tool that we have is our telescopes or even orbiting spacecraft looking down on a world, making measurements from a distance. So how does what we discover that way tell us about what's going on inside the planet? Well, first of all, what's going on the inside affects the surface and the atmosphere. And then the atmosphere itself affects the surface. Understanding how volcanoes give rise to different landscapes, different kinds of volcanoes, would tell us something about what's going on inside the world by looking at the surface rocks. Likewise, understanding the atmospheres, how do you get an atmosphere on a planet, where does it come from, and how does it affect the surface, that helps us understand weathering, and we can understand the planet as well. We also know there's a lot of things flying around the solar system running into planets, and that gives you craters. Now, one thing that we notice is that there's similar numbers of things flying around all over the place. For example, Earth and the Moon are both about 1 AU from the Sun, and so they should be hit by the same number of things. In fact, Earth should be hit more often than the Moon because it's bigger and pulls more things in. But we don't see as many craters on Earth. The reason for that is that Earth's surface resurfaces. We got volcanoes, we got weathering, we got plate tectonics. So the surface of the Earth is much younger than the surface of the Moon. When you look at the Moon, you see all those craters because once you get an impact feature on the Moon, nothing covers it up because the Moon does not have plate tectonics. The Moon does not have active volcanism right now, and so it didn't when it was younger. And so there's parts of the Moon that are very smooth where the surface, where the volcanoes resurfaced it, and so there's fewer craters there. But places that were not resurfaced have lots of craters. So by counting the number of craters, you get an idea about how old the surface is. One thing we almost universally notice is that small worlds have more craters than big worlds. And that's because the smaller something is, the quicker it cools off and the sooner volcanic activity stops. So the Moon and Mercury are both about the same size, and both of them are very heavily cratered. Mars is bigger and has fewer craters on it. But Venus and Earth are even bigger and have even fewer craters. Because the bigger the world, the longer it takes to cool off, and so the longer volcanoes happen. And so the more volcanoes, the more active the surface is, the more it gets covered over. So the cratering history tells us here. First of all, it tells us the age of the world, but we can also figure out that almost all the craters of the Moon occurred when the Moon was very, very young. So in the very early part of the solar system, there was actually a period of intense bombardment in which there was way more things flying around than there is right now, and so a lot more impacts. We call this period of intense bombardment the period of intense bombardment. Okay, astronomy way of naming stuff. After the initial bombardment, though, after this period of intense bombardment, the number of impacts dropped off, but we can find out that some of the biggest impacts occurred right at the end of the period of bombardment. And those giant impacts gave rise to the seas, or these dark splotches that we see on the surface of the moon. Those are smooth regions that get covered over with volcanic basalt. Earth, on the other hand, has far fewer craters. Far fewer craters because we are dynamic. We got more volcanoes, we've got plate tectonics, we've got an atmosphere, active weathering, erosion covers over and fills in craters, and so forth. And by the way, these two pictures are nowhere near to scale. The moon is about 1/4 diameter of the Earth, so it's considerably smaller. So the moon would be like kind of like that, drawn to scale. As I said, though, Earth does get hit, and there are craters here on Earth. This particular crater right here is to the east of Flagstaff, Arizona. It's called Barringer Crater, and I've actually been there, and you can notice here that when the crater actually happened right here, that it barely missed the visitor center right here. Yeah, right. Okay. Anyway, all right. So, but yeah, this is actually a museum piece, sort of. The Barringer Crater, you can actually pay for admission to go see the giant hole in the ground in Arizona, and so it's between Flagstaff and Winslow, right in the middle of the desert. Now, because it's in the middle of the desert, that means that there's very little erosion here, and so this thing doesn't change very much. So it's been the same way for tens of thousands of years. Very little erosion in there. Mars, like the moon, is interesting because parts of the Martian surface have lots of craters, and parts of the Martian surface have very few craters. That means that some parts of the Martian surface are younger than other parts of the Martian surface. Same thing with the moon. Parts of the moon's surface are smooth, parts are less smooth. Okay, so Mars has, more of the smooth stuff than the moon does, but still we have evidence here of a way of ranking the age of different parts of the surface. Typically, the smoother the surface, the younger the surface is. Chemistry. Every element in the periodic table has a unique spectrum. And so that means when you're doing spectral analysis, you can figure out which elements are which ones are making up what you're looking at. And what we notice is that when we look at the solar system, that by mass in the solar system, in the universe, in fact, about 70%, 71% of the universe is hydrogen, 27% is helium. Now, if you do this by number of atoms, you get different numbers. You get 91% hydrogen and 9% helium. Okay, so why the difference here? Well, because hydrogen and helium are the two lightest elements in the entire universe. So even though 9 out of 10 atoms are hydrogen atoms, they only make about 71% of the mass. Okay, 27% of the mass is helium, even though it's less than 1 in 10 atoms. Okay, so these are chemical abundances by mass and by number of atoms. This is for the universe, and this roughly matches what we see in the solar system. Now, this is not necessarily what we see in the planets. Now, this composition does very closely match what we see in Jupiter or Saturn. So they actually have chemical abundances very similar to the universe. This is almost the same composition as the sun. Earth, the terrestrial planets, are missing most of the hydrogen and helium. They have the other stuff. In your book is a table or a graph that looks like this. And let me explain this. This is what we call a logarithmic graph. So each line here on the left is actually each division here on the left is 10 times the one before. So that difference there is a difference of 10 times bigger. You can't draw it 10 times bigger, otherwise that hydrogen line will be up over the top of the computer right there. And so So we have to draw it logarithmically. But this is another factor 10 down here, another factor 10 down here. And what we notice is that if you keep running backwards here into the solar system, that you find that among the more common elements that we find in the solar system are carbon, oxygen, neon, magnesium, silicon, iron, nickel, and so forth. A little bit of sulfur in there too. Aside from the sulfur, what you find is that that composition of stuff there is those things that are the most common in the solar system are primarily byproducts of what you find in nuclear fusion inside stars. So as stars age, they start off with almost all hydrogen and then some helium. And as they age, nuclear fusion fuses the hydrogen into helium and the helium into carbon and oxygen and neon and magnesium and silicon and iron and so forth. So all those other elements that there are a bunch of that are in there are byproducts of that nuclear fusion. Either complete byproducts or partial byproducts. And so that's what this graphic is telling you. So Carl Sagan, astronomer from decades ago, was very famous for saying that we are made of star stuff. Sounds a whole lot better than we are made of thermonuclear waste products, okay, which is technically correct. But what you notice is there are some elements that there are just very few of out there. And so those elements here that are very few of are things that are not readily produced in this sort of nuclear fusion. So what we find is, for the compositions of the worlds, the terrestrial planets are primarily in their cores iron and nickel. Okay, the crusts are mostly silicon and oxygen. Okay, the atmospheres have nitrogen in them. Okay, there's also some carbon mixed in with the entire planet. It's actually, we're realizing there's more carbon than we used to think in the interior of the world. But you start mixing the carbon and the oxygen and nitrogen and oxygen and so forth, and that gives you the kind of atmospheres that you find. For the outer worlds, hydrogen and helium are the main things that make them up. Now, they have small amounts of iron, nickel, silicon, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen in them, but they are mainly hydrogen and helium. So the compositions of the worlds out there, once again, the inner ones are all similar and the outer ones are similar. And now, I will point out that there's enough oxygen mixed in, particularly with Uranus and Neptune, that the hydrogen and oxygen mix together to make water. And so really a large portion of Uranus and Neptune is H2O. But it's not going to be an H2O in a form you would recognize because it's under such high pressure. But these are the basic compositions of those worlds.